Yeah.
Bada bing, bada boom.
Hey, so that's actually in English, which is really helpful. So, anyways, I'm joined here with my beautiful wife, Amanda. We have been married for, almost 26 years? 26 years. So, a little bit about that. So, we actually graduated from the same college. We actually graduated from the same high school. We were high school sweethearts. We met in chemistry class, and she dragged me to Ohio University, where she went. She's from Ohio. I'm not from Ohio, despite popular opinion. But anyways, we went to school together, and I graduated in 2 years. And on June 14th, 1997, which was the day that Hillary Clinton was supposed to speak at our university, we decided to get married that day. And the next week, we were in Texas. So a little bit about that. My dad actually grew up in Pampa. The Hopper family's from Ada, Oklahoma. We always wanted to get back to Texas. When I was a kid, my dad worked at Western Electric, and it was Bell Labs. And so anyways, he had a job in Kansas City, Missouri. That's where I was born. When I was in 4th grade, he set us all down and said, hey, we're moving to North Carolina. And we were all terrified. I thought it was great. So I grew up, most of my childhood that I remember was in North Carolina. Interestingly enough, we found out that our family history, we're big into genealogy. The Hoppers are all from North Carolina for 150 years, starting in 1668, something like that. My family's all from there, so we were just in our own stomping grounds. And so anyways, when I was a junior in high school, my dad did the same thing. He said, we're going to move to Ohio. And I was like, oh no. I'd been in North Carolina long enough to know that that was Yankee land, and you didn't want to have any part of that. So we moved up there, though, and it was a lot of fun, and that's where I met my wife. So anyways, and when I was 20 years old, packed up, moved to Texas, quick as we could. We've been here actually living in the district for 26 years. Since 1997, we have lived in what is currently House District 64. So 3 boys. Our oldest is 23. He's getting married in December, Grant, and my middle son, Sam, is right there. And right there, that's the little boy that's getting baptized, actually. So anyways, and then my youngest is 17, and they're just outstanding young men. I actually am in the Texas State Guard. I'm a chief warrant officer. I've been in since 2014, enlisted, got D6, and I just felt very compelled to do something. And I've been in the defense industry for most of my career. I don't know if you've ever, how many people's ever been in the defense industry? It's you work in windowless environments. You don't see anything that's going outside, and you go in when it's dark and leave when it's dark. And somewhere in there, I said, hey, I got to do something. I feel like we're losing our country. And of course, we just got through Obama. Well, actually, we're still in Obama in 2014, in the thick of it. So anyways, joined the Texas State Guard, and that was one of the greatest things we ever did. Just outstanding men. My oldest joined a few years later. He's been in for 5 years. He's a sergeant. So being able to serve with your son is a really special thing. That's something that we've kind of lost in the U.S. military. A lot of people don't know the Texas Military Department. There's 3 branches: the Air National Guard, Army National Guard, and Texas State Guard. Texas State Guard, it's all the commissions come from the governor, so it's uniform, with the rest of the Guard. But Texas State Guard cannot be sent out of state. So that's state active duty missions only, which, luckily for us, is what Operation Lone Star is. So anyways, a little bit more about me. We actually started Wise County Conservatives in 2020, right after COVID, and it was just an amazing thing to find your people in your own county. Some of them are here, and we've been fighting ever since. I truly believe that Texas will save the Western world. That's what I'm fighting for. So anyways, one other thing to note, I actually was a professor at UNT for 2 years, an adjunct professor after I graduated with my master's degree at UNT, so I didn't mention that. But so we spent a lot of time in Denton over the years. Went to church at Cross Timbers just down the road for about 8 years. New life after that, and go to Rise Church in Decatur. Have been for many years. So anyways, we homeschool our children. I think that what is going on with our public schools has been going on for a while. We live in rural Texas, so C-Scope was basically the rural version of Common Core. We decided we'd pull our kids out and teach them about God and teach them godly things, and that has yielded really good fruit because we have 3 outstanding men that will stand up and tell you what they believe, and you won't be offended by any bit of it because they're right-wing extremists just like me. So what's facing our country? I mean, what is going on? I think that the right way to look at this, if we're honest in the year 2023, is that we are facing down the globalist and Marxist threat that is infiltrated every level of our federal government, probably some levels of our state government. And what you're seeing is basically a decline that is being pushed at every level by people with bad intentions that want to destroy our country. And we see some of them right here. We talked about the border situation. The reality is these people don't want borders. So talking about that, how many people have been watching the news? 10,000 interceptions in the last 5 days, or actually in the last day, 45,000 in the last 5 days. It's absolutely insane. If you take a very conservative estimate and just use the numbers that are published and not even the recognition that there's a large percentage of getaways that they never even see, if you just take the numbers, it's about 8.2 million in the last 2.5 years. There's only 30 million people live in Texas, y'all. So this is a real big problem. One of the things that people don't know, probably y'all do, have you ever heard of Liberty County, Texas? So you've seen those aerial photos, but to recognize that someone knew that this was going to happen, because in 2017, your Texas legislature passed the MMD to create that area. And now it's the largest trailer park in North America. So that's terrifying, and it should be terrifying to all of us. At the same level, our currency is under attack. You know, we have a tremendous debt, $33 trillion. It's increasing by at least $1 trillion every single 6 months. We have skyrocketing inflation. How many people know what CBDCs are? I know you all had a presentation at the Robson Ranch Republican Club recently that talked about some of that. Same level, we have the BRICS currency that basically is going to put tremendous pressure on the dollar. And that is the reason why I think that we've seen 4 years and just kind of wondering why Russia and China have been hoarding gold like nothing. It's because they knew that this was coming. They knew that they were going to eventually come to the point where the dollar was going to be displaced, and that's what we're facing down as a country. Here's the thing. The entire mission of these very evil people is to destroy personal independence and self-reliance. CBDCs to control your money, digital curriculum to manage the minds of your kids. How many people know about HB 1605 that was passed this session? HB 1605 is a $2 billion cost over 4 years to basically increase the amount of face time your kids have with digital curriculum. It's a vendor bill. How many people know how bad digital curriculum is for schools? Because what happens is that that information that's collected in your kid from the time that they're basically right out of the cradle to the time that they go to college, they know every kink, every fetish, every single wart of those people's personality. And if you don't believe, they probably also are very involved in basically crafting what your kid believes and what they think. But they can sell that information. It's a tremendously valuable to commercial entities because they know exactly how to market to those kids. There's nothing good about expanding digital curriculum, but the bad part is that it goes right into the globalist agenda. If you look at the UNESCO information they have, they are the ones that are pushing this. They are the ones that are pushing your kids towards more digital, more digital. Social media and government collusion, we saw that, and that became very apparent when Elon Musk took over Twitter. We found out how many federal agents were basically involved in the FBI and Twitter, at the end of the Obama administration. A lot of people weren't paying attention to that, but the reality is the social media companies were very much in bed with this agenda. Electric vehicles, which, make no mistake, one of my friends, Terry Hall, works for Texas Turf, and she makes the very good point that the point of electric vehicles, by the own admissions of the people that are running our government right now, are not to try to make the air cleaner, they're to keep you at home. Because they know that your travel independence is severely impaired if you can't charge your vehicle or travel more than 100 miles from your home. So ESG scoring, that is coming. What they're doing to the Chinese, they're going to do here. Carbon economy to eliminate regional and personal wealth. That is 100% the point, y'all, is to basically erode every fabric of independence that we have left. And this is my little pet peeve, but disincentivize property ownership and small agriculture. How many people know that the property tax system was one of the planks in the Communist Manifesto is how we actually take over this, a country and basically turn it towards socialism. Because you don't own property, it's called the socialization of property, according to Marx. Small agriculture is the same thing. We put every impediment that we can think of to try to eliminate small farmers. But small farmers are the folks that basically are independent, that are going to stand up for our country in the time of need. And I don't know if you all have been involved, but I had a pesticide license forever and let it lapse a couple years ago because I don't use them. But it was very interesting. For years, you have to go and take so many CEUs a year, and you go to the ag extension office and take a class. But here's the deal. Everybody that's in agriculture has one of those licenses, and there's nobody under the age of 65 that's in those rooms. It's a true statement. There's no young people. And that's a risk. That's a food security issue, and it happens because of policy of deterrence of getting people involved. Part of that is making land so expensive that you can never afford it. So if you wondered why we didn't manage to stop Chinese buying land in Texas, that's one of the reasons. So one of my very, very sincerely held beliefs is the fact that we are very much off the rails where our founders imagined. We are in the midst of basically a full-scale surrender of state and U.S. sovereignty. The globalist agenda, it imagines a world with no borders. We talked about the border, we talked about how many people are coming across. That's their aim. It's not a side effect, it's the goal. These people hate the system of government where the states and local control exists in any way. They want centralization of power. They're not even satisfied with power to be in Washington, D.C. They want power to be in Brussels or some place like that. How many people saw how many folks in U.S. Congress were willing to vote to cede to NATO the right to declare war? That should be terrifying. There is no way in God's green earth that one of our kids should be going off to fight a war in some foreign land, and our legislature or our Congress did not authorize it. We've already crossed that Rubicon, unfortunately, but this just makes it even worse. So basically, we have the federal government systematically ceding our sovereignty and coercing the states, basically extorting us in every way, shape, or form to basically increase the level to which the federal government has their tentacles in our state. How many people know that in the last legislative session, of all the bills that were filed, 22% of them cited U.S. code? There should be almost no laws in Texas citing U.S. code. It's the point of federalism. We should not be referring to U.S. code in state law. But when one out of every 5 bill, thousands of bills, 1 out of every 5 of them cites U.S. code, that's a really big problem. And that did not used to be the case in Texas. This is very intentional. So let's talk a little about what the founders imagined. This is kind of getting to my perspective on government in general. The states and the people are in charge, not Washington. So Declaration of Independence, let's just read this because I think it's really important. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government. And the Texas Constitution says almost the same thing. All political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded upon their authority and instituted for their benefit. So the rights of government, the powers of government, derive from the consent of us, and that's the key point of this slide. And the other thing that I'd like to point out that a lot of people don't know, but it's worth remembering, is that in Federalist 39, they made it very, very clear that the authority that came to form the federal government came from the people or the states, very specifically the states, because they said, not as individuals composing one entire nation, but as composing the distinct and independent states to which they respectively belong. It is to be the assent and ratification of the several states derived from the supreme authority in each state, the state legislature, the authority of the people themselves. Therefore, the act, therefore establishing the Constitution will not be a national, but a federal act. And it goes on to talk about if we were creating a nation, not a union, we would want the consent of each person. But by creating a federal union that is composed of many states, it's appropriate that the states themselves vote to create the federal government. So if there's any solution to be had, we would expect it to come from the states. And even more than that, I think it's worth understanding is like when we understand what the Constitution means and what it means to us, it's important to recognize that the interpretation, the ultimate interpretation comes from our states, not from some federal court. In other words, when there's a controversy about, take the border, for instance, Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution says that we have the right to protect ourselves against invasion. And then many will say, well, we just got to see what the Supreme Court says about that. No, not any more than we need to find out what the Supreme Court says about our Second Amendment rights, because the point of the founders was that the Second Amendment is natural and unalienable, which means that it comes from God. It does not come from men. And that also means that it's not just subject to the Supreme Court deciding whether or not you have the right to bear arms. If they decide that you don't tomorrow, it doesn't change the fact that you don't already have that right. It came from God. The same is true of the right to defend against invasion. That's the corporate expression of that individual right. So ultimately, we can defend ourselves against invasion regardless of what the Supreme Court says. And the founders agreed with this. They said the power is not delegated, or I'm sorry, let me go to the next slide and I'll come back to this. So Roger Sherman, he was actually from Connecticut. He was one of the only founders to sign all 4 major documents. He said the acts of Congress not warranted by the Constitution would be void, nor could they be enforced contrary to the sense of majority of the states. And Thomas Jefferson said, you seem to consider the judges the ultimate arbiters of constitutional questions, a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no single tribunal. I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society but the people themselves. So the reality is that if we're going to fix this country, it's going to be the states doing it. And that was embodied in the 10th Amendment. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by it to the states, reserved for the states respectively, or to the people. And Thomas Jefferson just reinforced this when he said, Thomas Jefferson, my hero, if you don't know. He's totally my hero. I consider the foundation of the Constitution is laid on this ground, that all powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states and the people. So if we are in a situation that we are in, who should we look for to basically stand up for our rights? And they made it very clear. And I promise I'm almost done with this. It gives me chills. I don't know if it gives you chills. I just love this stuff. But Federalist 26, nobody's ever seen this. I talk about it all the time because I think it's just incredibly important to recognize that our founders made it really crystal clear that the most powerful branch of government is not the Congress, it's not the president, it's the state legislature. They said independent of parties in the national legislature itself, as always in the period of discussion arrived, the state legislatures, who will always be not only vigilant but suspicious and jealous guardians of the rights of the citizens against the encroachments of the federal government, will constantly have their attention awake to the conduct of the national rulers and will be ready enough, if anything improper happens, to sound the alarm to the people and not only be the voice, but if necessary, the arm of their discontent. Do you believe that your Texas legislature is the voice or the arm of our discontent at this point? But that was the intent of our founding fathers, and that's what we should expect.
Andy, when was that written?
Huh?
When was that written?
That was Feller's Papers, so 1787. So let's switch gears and talk about Texas politics a little bit, talk about what happened this past session. I'd like to leave plenty of room for questions. I promise it's not going to be too much longer. But let's talk about some of the victories from last session. So HB 900, banning porn in public schools. I'd like to point out, this is blocked by the feds currently. Age verification for online porn, for kids. You don't want kids to be able to get on the internet and be able to look up stuff that nobody should be looking at. Blocked by the feds. Ban sexually oriented performances with minors present. How many people know that was going on in Denton County? That was blocked by the feds. I'm saying it's not going to resolve itself. I'm just pointing out the level of tyranny that we're under, that reasonable bills like these are blocked by our federal union. Ban genital mutilation of minors, so far so good. That's a tremendous victory. Some limited property tax relief. I'd like to talk about that a little bit later, but basically it ended up being $12.7 billion in new relief. Some of the failures, though, that I think it's important for us to recognize that we don't hear unless we're listening to opponents instead of incumbents. So there's no comprehensive border security. So Steve mentioned HB 20, which was basically going to be the landmark bill that would create a Texas border force that would be a permanent operative force. I mean, talk about just for a second what the impediments that we have with Operation Lone Star, and basically, even if we were repelling invaders, which Operation Lone Star historically has not done much of, even if that was going on, the issue is we have a bunch of M-Day troops that are down on the border. M-Day troops are troops that basically are on, intermittent missions. They're not called up all the time. They're not full-time military. And that they're down on the border. Some of these guys have been down there for 2 years. That's not what the Texas Guard was designed for, and these people need to be with their families, and if you were to have a permanent force on the border, your families would be down on the border with you. That's a sustainable solution, and that's what HB 20 would have done. And unfortunately, it was killed by a point of order by a Democrat parliamentarian in the final days. Little permanent property tax relief. Oh, by the way, maybe it could have actually gone back to committee and made it back to the floor if it hadn't been for the fact that they were impeaching Ken Paxton. Just a thought. Little permanent property tax relief. Again, there's only $7 billion in rate compression. So while we're excited about the raised homestead exemption, that will probably be a short-term relief because your appraisals are going up so fast. Massive expansion of digital learning, HB 1605, I mentioned that a minute ago. A lot of people don't know, and no one's talked about, there's a very significant expansion in the Green New Deal policies. If you do a search in the TLO for carbon as a pollutant, how many bills actually made it through this legislative session that basically recognize carbon as a pollutant? And if you look at the session before that, there were 0 bills. So something's happened in the past 2 years that those bills are being injected in our legislature and our Republicans are blindly voting for. HB 4305, that we talked about the currency situation with BRICS and with the CBDCs. This bill was an incredible bill and made it a lot farther than people thought. But we expect our legislature to stand for our rights ahead of the time that they're taken away. And unfortunately, HB 4305 was killed, and now we're going to be waiting for a future legislative session to basically do what should have been done this session and protect us from a dollar that may not continue to exist or a CBDC that you're forced into with no alternative. So this bill would have basically recognized that we have a Texas Gold Repository in Leander that was created 3 sessions ago, I believe, and basically leveraged another clause out of Article 1, Section 10 that recognizes the right of states to have currency that is backed 100% in gold. And unlike Article 1, Section 10's invasion clause, there is plenty of case law on this point, and there is plenty of examples in U.S. history where municipalities and states have used gold-backed currencies. So that is not a controversial legal thing to do at all. So that's what we need, that bill, and unfortunately it didn't make it. We did have the largest spending increase in Texas history. I have some backup slides if you want to look at it that shows you how that happened. I have to disagree with my opponent that was up here a couple times in the past month that made the claim that there was very little increase in spending. In fact, since 2021, it was $69 billion in increase in spending, a 42% increase. If you just go back to 2020, to the last legislative session, the 87th legislature in 2021, it was a 40% increase. That is the largest increase that we've ever had monetarily or percentage-wise in Texas history. We had the largest corporate welfare expansion in U.S. history by any state, $18 billion. And you think about the $33 billion surplus that we started with, $18 billion went from your tax money into the hands of corporations in the name of corporate welfare. This is basically a reconstitution of the Chapter 313 tax abatements that are explicitly opposed by the Texas Republican Party platform. And believe it or not, even the Democrats oppose it, and for other reasons. But here's the deal. The thing about it is that when they reconstituted this plan, they took all the language away that actually required businesses to show that jobs were created. So this is completely unfortunate. So again, only $12.7 billion we're giving back taxpayers out of $33 billion. We'll take whatever we can get, but I expected that entire surplus to go back to the hands of the people who gave it to the government. This is an interesting one. A lot of people don't know, but HB 12 was a bill that actually expanded Obamacare, and Brian Harrison has a very good write-up that basically explains, with his HHS background, that this basically provides a financial incentive for abortion. It does. Unfortunately, you can have an abortion and you still get the money. So it goes out from basically whatever it was, 2 months up to 12 months. But even if you abort your baby, you still have access to those funds. And that is completely unfortunate. And that was also passed by a Republican legislature. Because when I started paying attention to federal politics or state politics, I used to always be sucked in, like many people are, into federal land, like what's going on in Washington. But about the time Deborah Medina ran for governor, it was about the time that there was a big push in the state to basically say, we're not going to expand Obamacare in Texas. We don't believe in Obamacare, and there's no way we're going to put Medicaid exchanges in the state of Texas. And now, quietly, 10 years later, there's at least half a dozen bills that expanded it this way and that. And these are being passed by Republicans, and there's no outcry. And I think that's very unfortunate, because we still don't want to expand Obamacare. So, how does all this happen? What's the genesis of this? What is causing the Texas legislature, specifically the Texas House, to operate this way? And I think you have to put the blame in many ways on very liberal junk Dade Phelan. He's one of the only 3 House Republicans at the time that he was elected Speaker originally that was actually supported, got a passing grade from Equality Texas, which is a radical LGBTQ XYZ group. So the history on this is in June 2020, the Republican Party passed a platform that required all of the House Republican caucus to have a secret caucus basically a public caucus with a secret vote, right? And yet on November 4th, 2020, before the caucus met, before the Republicans got together, whatever destination that they choose to meet at, Dade Phelan gets on Twitter and puts this tweet out and says, hey, I've already won. I'm your speaker. Rest assured, I'm your speaker. And he lists all the people who supported him. All those yellow marks are Democrats. He got support from the Democrats first, and then he went to the Republicans. Exchange, what did he say? So he says, I'm the worst Republican in the Texas House. I'm awful. I'm your kind of people. Will you support me? And the Democrats are like, absolutely, we'll support you. But what are you going to give us? Well, what can a speaker give anyone? He can say, well, I can give you committee chairmanships. And that's what he did. And actually, that's what the last 3 speakers have done, starting with Strauss, then Dennis Bonnen, and now Dade Phelan. By leveraging this tactic of going to the Democrats first, what we are ensured of in the Texas House is that we will always have one of the most liberal members as the speaker. It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't work this way in any other state. Matt Rinaldi, our RPT chairman, has made the claim many times that he's researched every single state, and that we're the only Republican state that does this. Even the federal government doesn't do this. In fact, if you guys remember back when the 20 were trying to bargain by going to where the 15th ballot or whatever it was with McCarthy, do you remember the threat? You remember what Hannity and some of the talking heads on TV were sitting there saying? They were like, this is terrifying. It may force McCarthy to go to the Democrats for support. Well, you know what? In the Texas House, we do that as a matter of course. And that should bother all of us. So a little bit about Dade Phelan. Lots of different groups basically go and do analyses of bills and then the way that they vote, and they put together a scorecard. You can take which one you like, but the reality is by any measure, Dade Phelan is terrible. And that's where he is in the Republican caucus. And you can see the blue at the end is where the Democrats are. So there was a candidate that stood up this session to run against Dade Phelan, Tony Tinderholt, and you can see his scores. And you can also see with his little red circles how many people voted for him. There's only 3. So didn't get much support. The reality is once you consolidate support from Democrats, you pretty much got it locked up. And if you want to have any role or voice in the system, you feel like you're extorted to the level that you have to support the guy. So it's basically maybe it's a self-licking ice cream cone. Maybe that's a good metaphor. So I'd like to point out the fact that Democrats of today are nowhere with us. They are not with us at all. We should not be seeking their support. We should not be working with them. So last session, not this, the 88th legislature, but in 2021, there were 4 legislative priorities that made it to the House floor. Of all those priorities and all the votes, 150 people voted for each one of those, only 1 Democrat voted for constitutional carry. That's the level of congeniality we have with the Democrats. They don't support anything that we hold dear. 40% of committees in 2021 were chaired by Democrats. Going forward to this session, 20% of committees were chaired by Democrats, including business and industry. I think this is a very interesting slide because this is a group of women, that are in the LGBTQ caucus. And I have 2 circled here. Make special note that the one on the right is named Mary Gonzalez, who identifies as a the one on the left identifies as a pansexual, whatever that means. So here is the Committee on Appropriations. Who is the chair of that committee? Mary Gonzalez, pansexual Mary Gonzalez. And Julie Johnson is the vice chair of civil jurisprudence, which is actually a fairly important committee. But here's business and industry. Here's the ones that you cannot even believe. So there's 9 people in this committee. How many of these highlighted representatives that basically I can tell you are Democrats? What's the turnout on this committee? There's 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans. There is no way in God's green earth that we should be ceding control of entire committees to the Democrats. Even if you think that there's some ways you could stand on one foot and turn, twist and around and say that maybe there's some argument for having Democrats as chairs, there is no argument for giving committees, and as important as this one, to Democrats. So how did it flush out this session? Because I'm sure you heard different things. This is how it went down. The Republican Party of Texas put enormous pressure on every single elected representative to vote against the practice of putting Democrats in charge of committees. And so an amendment was put forth on the first day that the rules were discussed, and immediately a point of order was put forth by the Democrats, because that's one of the ways that Dave Phelan basically flexes his power and displays it to everyone, is he gets the Democrats to do his bidding. So he gets the Democrats to go up, and because it's him that's threatened by the fact that Democrat chairs would be abolished, because he would not be able to be speaker. But he gets a Democrat to come up and give a point of order, and the point of order was ridiculous. It's basically that this violates the state constitution. So, how many people know that the parliamentarian of the Texas House is named by Dave Phelan, and the parliamentarian is named Hugh Brady, and Hugh Brady worked in the Obama administration. Hugh Brady is a Democrat donor. So they get together and they huddle for way too long in this picture, and they basically come up with this idea that the Texas House cannot engage in politics, and that would violate the state constitution. No one can actually explain why, and not to mention the fact that the Texas House exists to run on politics. In fact, a very good example is our redistricting maps, which are by definition political maps. In fact, the Texas House argued after the 2010 redistricting cycle that in fact the maps were inherently political. So by making this argument on the floor of the Texas House, they've actually enabled the Democrats to go at any time to the courts and say, you know what, the Texas House says we don't do politics. These maps are political. I can show you right now why these political boundaries exist. I think these maps should be thrown out. They should be nonpartisan. And that would be awful for all of us. But they've opened that door. But anyways, they argued that it was a political map, or it was a political act, and that was unconstitutional. But all was not lost. It turns out that you can override a point of order in the Texas House. And how many people do you need to override it? 10 people. But there's only 7 names on this slip. And so unfortunately, that point of order was prevailed, and the amendment failed, and we had Democrats in the Texas House, and many of our members, including the fellow that I'm running against, voted for these rules. And by the way, he did not sign this. Many reps did, but he did not. So there are some other things. I just kind of quickly go through some of the other things on that first day of the rules that were actually very important. So somebody put together another amendment that said, hey, it's kind of fair if the author requests it that we should at least have a vote on everything. And you can see how many people voted for that. The Greens are yes. Almost no one. And then there's another practice in the Texas House that nobody knows about, where basically they can blacklist you If you're Tony Tinderholt and you run against the speaker, they can basically tag your bills. It's a known practice that they all deny. For many sessions, there have been amendments against it, and very few people voted to end that practice, where basically your entire district is blacklisted and you don't get any, your bills get no traction at all. So what's going on? Texas is incrementally surrendering, and I don't believe we have decades. I don't know if we even have years to save our country. I firmly believe that Texas should save our country in the Western Hemisphere. Every session we pass a few good bills, but unfortunately we continue to grow Texas government. We keep allowing a border invasion, and basically we keep allowing Republicans that are not actually Republicans to continue to promote their agenda instead of ours. We're depending upon our people that we represent, that they represent us, to stand for our values, and I don't believe that they are. So here's the last slide, or second to last slide. We're almost there. So here's how we win, and this is the part, door to door, when you're sitting and talking to people, people know that we're in a bad spot. I've made this point before, and I think it's important for everyone to understand. It's not made up. We've done this a couple times, and 2 years ago, knocking doors, this is what you got at the door. Man, Washington's a disaster, but at least we have Republicans in Texas. That's what we got. I'm serious. That is the predominant attitude of voters 2 years ago. And the reason is not surprising, right? Because they watch Fox News. They watch national media that basically gives you this very Washington-centric attitude towards governance. And we have been brought up as kids, probably by a school system that doesn't believe in federalism either, to sit there and minimize the right of your state, the right of your local community to basically kind of make more of an impact on your life than the federal government. There's no doubt that you can make more of a change to all of the problems we've listed in Austin than we can make in Washington, but you would not know that watching the federal news. So it doesn't surprise me at all that people feel that way, but what I'm saying is this year, when we're knocking doors, people are like, I'm about ready for Plan B, y'all. This is what people are at. They are mad as a hornet, and they think that there's going to be a conflict. And that is the honest to God truth. And so it is our responsibility to make sure that we take every single action that we can take to grasp at every peaceable straw that we can to try to turn government to do the things that it always should have been doing. And that's my attitude. So how do we do that in Texas? We mentioned it before. Just like we needed 20 in the U.S. House of Representatives, the magic number in Texas is we need 10 people. We need 10 conservatives that are willing to stand up to leadership, because once we have that, we will be able to turn the tide. The reality is that it is valuable, even if you're, and people ask all the time, it's like, well, how are you going to be a good representative? You got to work with people. You got to, and it's like, okay, but there's something to be said. There's much to be said for the idea that you need people that are in conservative districts to represent that district strongly and unashamedly and with vigor and tenacity. Because if you get enough people that are willing to do that, you can move the needle and change the culture of the body. The culture of the Texas House is stagnant and awful. The Senate passes good bills. You can go through many examples of great legislation that passed in the Senate and died in the House. The governor may have some qualms here and there, but the thing is he signs conservative legislation when he crosses his desk. So the issue is the fact that it dies in the Texas House. So we have to fix this body, and the way we do that is we have to win a few districts. We have to basically turn that body from a place that only has 10 people or 7 people that are willing to sign it to 10 people that are willing to sign these point of orders. Because once you have that, the speaker's power will be diminished greatly, because the centralization of power in the speaker is really what we're fighting. It's worth noting that in Texas history all the way until the 1970s, you can only find one example, I believe, of a speaker that served more than once and then served another term. And I believe even that example was somebody who wasn't speaker for at least one term and then served another term. But starting in the 1970s, you started to see speakers run multiple times, but it ramped up big time in the 21st century. Now all these people believe they should be speaker for many sessions in a row. Historically, the Texas House Speaker doesn't even want to get that job because, you don't get to vote on anything. The only thing you have to do is sign committee chairs, and you just stand there and gavel and do all the parliamentary procedure that no one wants to do. Nobody wanted that job until they realized how they could weaponize it and centralize power. And that's actually what we're standing against, is we're asking to enact changes in the Texas House that will decentralize the power of the speaker and give the power back to the people. So, what do I believe in? I believe in moving the needle in Texas. I'm very proud of this artwork, by the way. So on the left-hand side, this is my attitude on left versus right. And a lot of people ask, well, what do you think a conservative is? And what do you think a Republican is? And whatever. I really very much agree with Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson, as I mentioned, is my hero. Thomas Jefferson envisioned a left versus right scenario where the far left was basically total totalitarian control, and the far right was absolute anarchy. And we are trying as conservatives to try to have as little government as possible so that we don't live in anarchy, but we live with near microscopic government. Government's so small that you can barely see it. So this is my scale. I believe in local control. I believe in states' rights. I believe in government that it's small and not in your lives. Government that limits itself, that doesn't increase spending by 42% in 1 year. So I'd love to take some questions. Sorry I've talked so long, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of who I am and what I believe in.
What we did, we took the questions that y'all gave us for our Representative Stucky, and we kind of tweaked them a little bit to make them appropriate for Andy. So Mike Slocum is going to ask questions of Andy when we get through, depending upon if you're ready to go or not, or if you're all ready to leave or not. Then we'll open it up to the floor. So here you go. There's
Thanks,
that.
Steve.
Okay, I think they said there's another one down here.
Right here. There you go.
Yeah.
So as Steve mentioned, we had a lot of our members and a lot of conservatives submit some questions that they thought were important to them, and I think they speak to a lot of the Robson conservatives. First on the list, we deal with election integrity. And it was the #1 priority of Republicans for the 2022 primary ballot, as well as the #1 priority for the Republican Party and the state delegates 2020 and 2022, likely due to the influx of illegal aliens or irregularities of the undocumented throughout the state. But please address the election integrity concerns of the voters of Denton and Wise County, as well as changes that you think you could make to ensure election integrity.
Sure. Well, I can tell you that door to door, people are concerned about election integrity. And the thing is that it's not an option for government not to do anything when people don't believe and are not turning out to vote. So it's a real phenomenon. And I think it's rooted in actual tangible reality that there are many ways that the system can be misused. I am a software engineer. I don't know if I mentioned that. I don't think I did. But I am a software engineer, and I don't trust software at all. No software engineers do. The Texas State Guard has the cyber mission for the state, and I could go through all these very, very talented and credentialed people that do cybersecurity for a living, and they will tell you that you should not trust any computers with software. So I think on that basis alone, I think that until we get to the point that we're in a period of trust of technology that we do not exist in today, there is no way that we should be trusting systems with software that is not open source, that is not known to us, that we can't audit, that we can't do a public information request and see what is going on inside. Because we need we definitely need a mechanism that is open and understandable to people. People need to be able to participate in the election process and understand what's going on. When you push a button and it does something, but you can't show that person what is going on internally because it's represented in microscopic bits on that a circuit board that they could never interrogate or inspect, that is not a transparent, open system. Whether or not it's efficient or whether we like it, a hanging chad is a transparent system that people can look at. Surely we can come up with a better mechanism than that. I did put together a couple slides on election integrity, actually on many topics. that I want to talk about some of the things that actually got shot down. So this session, we actually had a couple things happen. So I want to talk about first is one of the biggest challenges we have in election integrity in Texas is the fact that we have a looming federal takeover of elections. The For the People Act that you saw a couple years ago, the big worry that we had is that they would basically force us to submit to weaponized mail-in ballots. And so there was a bill that was filed in March 2021, HB 4507 by Mike Schofield, that basically would have split federal and state elections if something like that ever happened. It would be a trigger bill to protect our elections. And that bill, unsurprisingly, died in the Texas House. Our representative did not support that bill. But now we're in a situation where if that trigger language was in effect in law today, it would have already triggered because the federal court has come down and said that Texas is required to accept mail-in ballots even if the number, the voter ID on the ballot is not incorrect. And that's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. There was a couple good bills this session, HB 5234 by Steve Toth. There's just a laundry list of things that this would have done. This approximates many of the things that I think we conservatives expect. Shortened early voting, making sure that enough ballots are required to be available at polling locations. All these things have criminal penalties because if there's no penalty, nobody follows it. Ballots to be printed in Texas, chain of custody for ballots from vendors, video recordings of all aspects of elections. Believe it or not, especially in small counties, that's not actually done. County sheriffs to investigate all irregularities. People don't know county sheriffs don't do that. Printed physical poll lists and signatures required from every voter. Cancellation of mail-in ballots before allowing voters to vote again. Believe it or not, that's not required today. It's also terrifying. There was another bill, SB, that died in Texas House, by the way. It never even got a committee. It's actually sad, didn't even get a vote in committee. SB 1039 would have prevented a civil penalty for failing to address a reported election I can't say it. Whatever it is, that word right there, that word. So it passed Senate, killed in the House in final days with a 4 vote. My opponent didn't vote for that one either, or support it. So the thing about it is that we have 3 main issues with election integrity that we need to solve. One of them is the belief in the system, and a lot of that's the machines. Number 2 is that, and this is the part that I cannot believe, there's no mechanism to require voter rolls to be cleaned at some interval. That is appalling, but I cannot believe that every time, and there's always a bill that does that, and it always goes nowhere. And there's some reason that our elected representatives don't want to clean voter rolls, and they should clean voter rolls. Voter rolls should be cleaned every 5 years. If you want to register to vote, you register every 5 years. Is that too much to ask? I don't think it's too much to ask. But the reality is that those voter rolls have all manner of folks on there. And if anyone who has knocked doors knows that you have an enormous number of homes that you hit that are not the person that is in the voter data. And that is a problem, and it is not being addressed. No one is getting paid to address that issue. So anyways, I think that there's much that we can do here. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it covers it very well. Thank you for that. And noting that Representative Stucky did not vote for any of those.
Well, I think he didn't sign on. He didn't sign on to them. They didn't go anywhere.
So many of our members here have expressed a sentiment related to the Democrats being committee chairs. And they have asked the question, would you ever, under any circumstances, agree to allow Democrats to be in committee chair positions if it were in your court?
Under no circumstances, and I would vote against the rules as a whole if that's all I could do. So, easy enough.
Fair enough, thank you. The Second Amendment, I'm just going to let you talk about your defense or your opposition to the Second Amendment.
Yeah. So I reload in my basement. Like I'm a huge 2A guy. I believe the foundation of the Second Amendment is to protect ourselves against the government. That's not controversial at this point. That's exactly what the founders said. an armed society is a polite society. I fully believe that there should be no infringements whatsoever. I think that the NFA is an infringement on the Second Amendment that should be repealed and abolished. I believe we should have an actual Second Amendment sanctuary in Texas. A lot of people don't know that 2 years ago, a Second Amendment sanctuary bill was passed, but in the final hours of its passage, the author removed all of the useful language. So there's like the Missouri style, there's a few states that have passed like the Missouri style Second Amendment sanctuary, which Second Amendment sanctuaries are wrapped around the idea of nullification and interposition. The idea that your right of the Second Amendment is natural and it is not subject to federal courts and their decisions, and therefore any transgressions of them are criminal. It should involve a criminal penalty. And so those bills basically require state law enforcement, state DPS, to basically interpose and arrest any agents from any level of government that's trying to impose some sort of egregious gun confiscation or anything like that. And so all that language was removed. So basically you have a Second Amendment sanctuary bill that requires nothing out of government. And we need one that actually does. So anyways, hopefully that answers your question.
Very clear, I appreciate that. One of the important issues of the 88th session and 2 special sessions, and you talked about it at some length, was the property tax reduction. Your opponent and other reps have stated they passed the largest tax cut in history. And if you could go over again the difference between their description of the $14.2 billion and the 11.6 or whatever it was that actually got cut.
I was hoping you'd ask me that because if we could have a debate, I'd love to do that. But since we are kind of debating from afar, I do have a slide on that. So let's talk about the largest tax cut in history. So these are actual screenshots of, and honestly, all the legislators, except for a few, are putting this exact material out. So it's not like this is their material, they get it from their consultant, and they all share that. So they all say about the same thing, $18 billion in property tax, largest tax cut in Texas history. But you see, I don't know if there's a pointer. I don't know, does that work? No, that actually turns it off. So that was a mistake. Does this come back on? Anyways. Does it come back on?
I don't know, what'd you push?
I pushed that top button.
You pushed the off button.
Yeah, I know. I thought it was, I was hoping it was a laser pointer.
Yeah.
So there was a time that I would be able to look at that button and tell you what it did before I pushed it, but that time is gone. I can't see anything anymore. It's just kind of fuzzy right here. So I have good distance vision, but that's about it. I did. I really did it.
Makes me feel better about my mistake.
Yeah.
Explained it real well, and
Yeah. So going through this, basically what ended up happening is that these folks are advertising that there's an $18 billion property tax cut, but in 2019, the Texas legislature passed a tax compression and reform bill that required all future legislatures to pass it all along because they told you in the year 2019 that you were going to get a property tax cut. And they didn't say in 2019 you're going to get a property tax cut, but it's going to come back in 2021. They said it's going to be permanent. So what ended up happening is in 2021, they passed this, or in 2019, they passed this bill. In 2021, they allocated $6.1 billion from the budget to pay for this tax relief. And in 2023, our Texas legislature said, we only passed $12.7 billion in tax relief, but if we count the $5.3 billion that we have to pass on from 2019, we can mark it up to $18 billion. And so that's what they did. That's exactly what happened this session, is that there is no more than $12.7 billion in property tax relief that was actually passed on to you. But in fact, $5.3 billion of the $18 billion advertised value came from 2019. And you can prove that, and I have slides that do prove it, that in fact, the physical note on the bill says very clearly $12.7 billion. And if you want to find where the $5.3 billion came from, I actually had to put some effort into that. If you ever read budgets, the state budgets, they're insane. And of course, they just can't give you a number that is $5.3 billion. It's like added up from 3 different things going into the Texas School Fund. But I found them, highlighted them, and I was like, I'm not totally sure. I think that's right. So I called up a couple economists, and they looked at it, and they said, you're spot on. That's where the $5.3 billion came from. So you can see not only the fact that the $5.3 billion that they're advertising as part of the $18 billion wasn't even a part of the property tax relief in the second special session. It was passed in the budget in the regular session. It would have been passed on to you even if they didn't have a special session at all. So I have a really, really big problem with legislators telling you that you got 30% more tax relief than you got, and then getting up here and telling you and doubling down. Interestingly enough, the first time my opponent talked about it, he said $18 billion. This last time, he's now got it to 18.6. So I don't know where any of those numbers are coming from, but they're not coming from the budget or from anything the state has passed.
Thank you. So we've had some questions about your opinion on whether or not Texas legislators should have term limits. And if so, what might those be?
Yeah, I think term limits should be reasonably low, 2 to 3 terms at most. I think it's worth mentioning why, though. It was debated during the Constitutional Convention about whether term limits should exist. But here's the basic argument that after 250 years of American history and 187 years of Texas history is that the longer that you're down there, the more you answer to your colleagues instead of answering to your constituents. And that's inevitable, right? And so when you hear arguments like, well, if you're down there longer, you get to be a better legislator. I wasn't nearly as good as I am now. Well, that's within the system that assumes that you have people that have been there since the 20th century, which we have today. We have people that have been in the legislature for 30-some years. And those people end up being severe stovepipes of information and power that if you had a legislature with term limits, you would have a bunch of active individuals that haven't managed to consolidate power under their stovepipe yet. You would have a more accessible system that people were able to get in there and get some work done. And working with your colleagues would be less important than representing folks in the midst of basically a little bit of chaos. Instead, what we have is we have a Texas House specifically that has people that have centralized tremendous powers under their wings, and they are gatekeepers to that power. And the only way that you can get things done is to basically play the game and work with these people and make deals with these people and pass bills that you don't believe in and kill amendments that you do believe in. I'll give you one really good example. I'll keep the editorializing to myself. There was a bill that I mentioned before, HB 12, expansion of Obamacare. You are amazing, Steve. So expansion of Obamacare was a bill that we knew was a bad thing, and it was a Republican Dade-Phelan priority, right? And so we knew that this bill was going to get passed. And so I was sitting there watching this bill. I was like, this is important. And I'm looking at who voted for it, and there was only 5 or 6 folks that voted against it. And I was like, man, these are heroes. Let me look at this. One of them was Lynn Stucky. And I said, wow, that's amazing. I was about to text the guy and say, good job, Lynn, that was excellent. But what do you think happened 2 hours later? He changed his vote. And that is the level of power that leadership wields over people in the Texas House. And that's why we don't need people down there for decades. What you got?
Yeah, that's a good one. Important. This is a little bit of a long question, a little bit convoluted, so follow along. Mm-hmm. There are some of us in this room who may question the motives of the speaker donating large amounts of money or payments in kind to representatives' campaigns, particularly in the areas of reliably Republican voters, either direct or payment in kind. In fact, Representative Stucky's campaign took in over $100,000 from Speaker Phelan. How does this amount of money, being his largest single contributor, do you think affect his votes? And as an elected representative, would you vote your constituents' collective will?
Yeah, well, I feel very strongly that the right answer to that last question is that I'm going to stand here and tell you what I believe. And I'm going to passionately and tenaciously fight for those things when I'm down there. Because if I don't do that, then I'm a liar. I actually had a Democrat, when we were knocking doors, that asked me this question. They said, well, you represent everyone. You even represent me. She believed in all kinds of crazy stuff. And she votes as a Republican primary. It's not like I'm knocking Democrat doors. Anyways, this lady was sitting there asking me this question. She's like, well, aren't you going to represent me? I'm your Democrat. I said, listen, I'm going to take your call. But I was like, I'm telling you, I don't agree with anything you say. And if I started voting the way you want me to, then that means that all these people that I told you that I believe in X, Y, Z, I'm a liar then, right? So that's the answer to the last question. But as far as the ownership or the influence that the money wields, I think it's substantial. I think that the best way for you guys, everyone, to vote is to, first of all, the push cards, all the things you get in the mail, just throw them away. It's all lies. I'm saying mine's not a lie, but I mean, everyone else is a lie. But they are lies, and you shouldn't pay attention to that. I cannot tell you how many people that you knock doors, especially that open their door and then they open a little cabinet or something by the door and they pull out a bunch of mailers and they say, which one are you? And that's terrifying, and we should vote better than that. And the best way to figure out who to vote for, if you don't know anything else, is there's a bunch of websites. Transparency USA is a good one. There's Open Secrets. There's lots of websites that basically distill the financial information that is publicly reported and allow you to basically visualize it. And you can go click on all those PACs and all those lobbies, and you can see who they donate to. Do you agree with those people? There's actually another website called grassrootspriorities.com, and that website is run by Grassroots America. And they don't do any massaging of the data. They basically just say, okay, let's take it one step further. Let's look at all the PACs that are basically registering as lobbyists for bills, and let's figure out which ones they actually support and figure out what issues they care about. And that's even more informative. So you just know those two things, but if you just look at the money, it's really important. But as far as the Dade Phelan money, I was hoping you'd ask that as well, because I think that it's important. So these are the individuals that received money from Dade Phelan, and here's how they voted for impeachment. I think that's very telling. But I also think it's very interesting to recognize how these people who are on this list score by anybody's scorecard. So Phelan-funded incumbents. This happens to be Texas Fiscal Responsibility, but you can look at Rice University. They're about the same. We're talking 40, 50%. The highest rank, David Spiller is a rock star. He got 79%. And Texas Fiscal Responsibility scores people based on growth of government. So basically, bills that have big price tags. But interestingly enough, it's probably the only opportunity I'll have to do this.
Go back.
What's that?
Would you go back?
That other one that listed the amounts?
Sure. Yes, ma'am.
Is that our tax money?
I want to ask a dumb question.
Yeah.
Where's that money coming from?
Yeah, well, that's where you need to look at Transparency USA, because it's fascinating. It almost seems like we're evolving door at times, because if you look at, so there are three categories of Republican reps. I've done this research. There are people that are in this category that are recipients of Dade Phelan. Then if they're in a district that's not contested, they're donors to Dade Phelan. So, and then there's people who get nothing or take nothing, or give nothing and take nothing, and those are the conservatives. So those are in my opinion, those are the three categories. But where does the money come from? It comes in large parts from representatives, from senators that don't have any sort of a primary contest, and they give money to Dade Phelan. So you're either You're either playing team with him by taking money because you have a rep or you have an incumbent, or you're an incumbent and you have a challenger that's a worrisome challenger, and you take a lot of money. I will point out, and it's all public record. I will never slam my opponent's character. This is all public information. How he votes is his deal, and I'd love to be able to talk about that. And there's nothing personal about it. But of all the candidates that received money from Dade Phelan in the primary, Lynn Stucky got the number one. All the people that are above him got more money in the runoff. So, just so you know, it's all about having a primary challenger. Where does the rest of the money come from? A lot of it comes from Texas for lawsuit reform. A lot of it comes from Texas Realtors, Farm Bureau. These are organizations that fund both Democrats and Republicans. Texas for lawsuit reform doesn't just fund Republicans. People conflate it and say, oh my gosh, that's a Republican lobby. No, it's not. Associated Republicans and Texans gave money to Beto. And that's another source of funding. My opponent got $27,000 from Associated Republicans of Texas. That PAC is well known to be run by Karl Rove and Dade Phelan. Just so we're really clear, there are sides to this entire battle. And so a lot of it goes to that. But like I say, since this is the only opportunity I'll probably have in this neighborhood to make this case, my opponent really hates who funds me. Really hates it. And I think the real issue is they don't like anyone funding challengers. So Defend Texas Liberty is a PAC. It's run by Jonathan Stickland, who used to be a former rep, wildly conservative. And I don't know why it's formatted the way it is, but here you can see, here are the people, the names that you might recognize that are funded by this PAC. And you may not like every single name on this list, but you probably like a lot of them. But what's more telling is that if you look at the scores of the people that they fund, there's a substantive difference. So the reality is the best way to figure out who you should vote for is who's funding them, in my opinion.
So follow the money.
Follow the money.
Yep.
All right. So moving on to off the campaign finance. The Paxton impeachment. What part of that impeachment was the most troubling for you personally?
You know, I was actually in the Capitol, I was in the Capitol, I was in the gallery when they were impeaching him. And it was interesting because my friend Mike Alcott was with me, and he's personal friends with Ken Paxton. So after the thing was over, he was like, hey, let's go to Paxton's office. I was like, oh, I've never been to Paxton's office. So we went over to Paxton's office, and we were there when the SWAT team showed up to escort him out. And that was fascinating. The level, especially after we watched the entire thing play out, the level to which they were wanting to humiliate and excoriate his character by having people come in with body armor to walk him out was insane. But the body language, that bothered me. But the body language of the people in the House floor bothered me even more. We didn't even know until we saw the clips and watched the entire trial the level to which they had no evidence. But I suspected, but didn't know. The process was insane. We can talk about that. But the troubling thing is to watch the behavior of the people in the House floor that didn't have a care in the world. They were sitting there kicking back. Saw a couple people with feet on their desks, people yawning. People at one point while they were laying out this case, about half of the chairs were empty. And the most important thing that you can see when you see a vote like this is the way that the board lights up. Now you saw that board that I showed you a couple times. Usually votes go like this. You know, you see light, bleep, 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 and then brrr. That's usually how votes work. And the reason is, and no one will admit this, but they're watching for someone else to vote before they vote. And that's just the honest to God truth. But when the Dade Phelan put up the call to the vote for impeaching Ken Paxton, the entire board was like, bam. They all knew exactly how they were going to vote, which is fine, except for the fact that they weren't even listening. That was very bothersome. the fact that, as Representative Smithy and Matt Schaefer and Brian Harrison pointed out on the floor, that there was no testimony taken under oath, that there was a shotgun 48-hour window where they decided that they were going to impeach this guy. We heard them explain that the last time this happened was in 1917, and it took weeks of deliberation and evidence and testimony that was open to all, but no House member other than the folks that were on the committee. But now that you mentioned it, and I'm sitting here thinking about the things that bothered me, the most bothersome thing was after the trial was over to see Representative Murr, the guy with the mustache, get up and explain how he would do everything the same if he were to do it again. But then when asked about Paxton specifically, he decided that he didn't want to go on record saying anything about Paxton. So he motioned to the woman to his right, who was a Democrat, radical LGBT caucus Democrat, that got up with a quivering lip and explained how Paxton was a criminal. I think Republicans behaving this way is going to be the end of our civilization. There's no question. Up to it was I wanted to see the language in the plank of the legislative priority be education freedom instead of school choice. And ultimately, I would say myself and many others that are more significant than me prevailed. And that's the language that's in the Republican priority. It's not school choice for a reason. It's education freedom. Because I think if you talk to people who are homeschoolers or private school families, the thing they're most terrified about is a takeover of the system. And it's a legitimate concern, especially, it probably wouldn't be a legitimate concern if we had a House that was like our Senate. But when we have a House whose school choice legislation that they propose is basically like $300 million, recognize it costs about $5 million, I think, to basically fully fund all of the entire school choice system. So it's basically $300 million that would only basically give a very, very small fraction of kids any sort of ability to move out of the public school. But then it actually allocated, I believe, like $10,000 to the school. So it's double paying. If you take a kid out of public school, you're not only paying for the school choice, but you're also paying the school to allow them to leave, which is insane. It's an assault on taxpayers' hard-earned dollars. So with that context, I think it's a very valid concern that eventually government will basically put strings and ruin something good, which is like homeschool and private school education that is independent and unencumbered. If you look at collegiate education, I think that's a really good case study. More money comes in from the federal and state than comes in from tuition. And so they're just as much on the hook as public tuition or public as institutions to basically bend a knee to government at some level and to acquiesce when asked to basically take something out of their curriculum or to not to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and something like that. So that could very easily happen if you do a thought experiment and say, okay, so what happens when state money starts going to some very, very conservative Christian school, and that Christian school then realizes that 80% of their money comes from the state, and then the state comes along because we get Beto in or something and says, hey, you know what? You got to teach about 18 genders. What is that school going to do? Is it going to do the hard thing and lose its entire enrollment? Or is it just going to say, it's just one thing? If you ever read Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, what you find out is that the Lutheran Church was willing to get seed the gospel to the point that Jesus fought his way off the cross because Hitler did not want a savior that had basically willingly given himself for the salvation of many. So that is a recognizable landmark in history that we cannot repeat. So long-winded answer, I think that if I were in the legislature and a bill came forward for school choice, I would fight tooth and nail for a constitutional amendment like Phil King put forward, Cody Vasut put forward, that would have guaranteed, the right of homeschoolers and private schoolers to be unencumbered by strings. Subject to that, I am all in on changes that we can make that would actually offer some sort of competitive market that would basically force public schools to do better. I think that's the main argument for school choice. So.
Did we have some people from the audience that had some questions for the committee?
Wait.
Need a microphone.
Here, let's do this.
Okay.
Come on over
I've
here.
got it.
Here we go.
Oh, he's got one.
Please briefly explain Texas and where it is in the legislature, and will it be on the ballot in November?
So there's a plank in the Texas Republican Party platform, plank number 225. That was passed by about 90% of delegates. I was there. Wasn't controversial at all. There is an effort to put a referendum on the Republican primary ballot to allow people to basically, it's a poll. And so that's where the state of that is that they're collecting signatures for that. There are two ways to get things on the primary ballot. One is this petition process that's never been exercised. So I don't know if it's even possible to get enough signatures for something like that. The other option is to get the state Republican Executive Committee to put it on the ballot. But that's, if that answers your question, that's where that's at, is that they're trying to put it on the primary ballot.
This is an election integrity issue. We use a driver's license ID. Where in this process do we check whether or not that person is a citizen?
No, it's a great question. So the reality is that as it stands right now, you can come in and say, I forgot my driver's license or I forgot my voter ID card, but I still want to vote. And they're required to let you vote, and it doesn't even have to be a provisional ballot. You can actually vote with an affidavit. So the question is when does it get checked and cross-referenced in that situation? And the answer is, it may never. So that's the worst case scenario.
I'm an immigrant. I got my driver's license before I had my citizenship. I have moved to many different states. I have never been asked whether or not I'm a citizen or to prove I'm a citizen.
Right. You're exactly right. That is terrifying and awful, and that is exactly what they want. They want a system that eventually normalizes the people to believe that everyone should have a voice. And this isn't, I'm history buff. This isn't the first time in our long storied history that this has happened. There's a really good book called, can't remember the name of the book, think of it in a second, but Empires of Trust. And it actually talks about how when Rome was in the period of time where it was kind of clear that they were turning into what we are, a totalitarian state, but they still fashioned themselves as a republic. They still went through the motions of being a republic. That only people in Rome or in the nearby central Italy could vote. And the Greeks believed they should be able to vote because they believed that Rome controlled them. One of the things this guy points out in this book that was very interesting, he says they've done polls in Europe, and a strong majority of Europeans believe that the American elections affect their lives more than their own elections. And they believe they should have the right to vote in US elections. So I know that this sounds crazy, but I don't think anything should sound crazy. These people want universal suffrage for American elections, and that's what they're aiming for. So this is part of this globalist agenda that we're talking about. It's not something, that we just need to tweak and, no one's thought of. Go ahead, sir.
Any more questions?
I'm sorry, you recognized?
I hope so. Recognize me.
Oh, do you want to take mine?
I don't know who you are.
Just in case, is there anybody here that is not registered to vote? Oh, good, okay. I was going to register. I'm here. Precinct Chair.
If you live on the west side of Robson Boulevard, that is your precinct chairman who is here. If you're not registered to vote, he has all the things you need to vote.
One more question.
Last question. Here you go, talking to my hand.
Just to clarify, are you in favor then of school vouchers where state money follows the child to
away from the public school to a private institution?
Yeah, well, so I don't think anyone's proposed a voucher plan. They're always ESAs, educational savings accounts or something of that nature. But yes, I'm in favor of it. But I'm just, that long-winded answer is that I'm just letting you know I would fight tooth and nail to make sure that there are no strings and as many statutory and or constitutional guarantees of no strings to homeschoolers and private schools with that money.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Appreciate your time. Well,